I'm John Tyner of Public Affairs Forum, and Washington County Public Affairs Forum is a public service of the members to get ideas out in the public generally about politics in the community. One of the ideas is to honor Veterans Day, and John Leeper, Commissioner Leeper, is here, and I'd like to have him say a few words about Veterans Day and its relevance to us here today, and then we'll put the major program on with our two erudite and actually informed speakers. That's not really a departure from our usual form, but it is. We actually have people who are actually authorities. So I'll introduce you in just a second as soon as we get John Leeper up here. Commissioner Leeper was an officer in our military, and he has some thoughts. So, and he's succinct and he's to the point. And so we'll begin our program shortly. Commissioner Leeper, are you ready? I surprised him with the foresight to bring to almost all my affairs. I waited for the last moment. Come on up here.
Good morning. I would just like to say a few words about veterans, persons who have served in the armed forces at any time, by George, for whatever length of time they were in. It does, I think, speak well for the country. It also is an expression on Veterans Day for their service, and that applies to both men and women. Over 14% of our current military are women, and ladies and gentlemen, I would appreciate it if all of you who are veterans would raise your hand at this time. Thank you. There were any number of ceremonies yesterday. I participated in one in Beaverton, sponsored by the American Legion Post 124, and it went very well, and I saw several of you there. So John, thank you for the opportunity.
I'm sorry about being dilatory and negligent in this regard. They have those newfangled things called calendars. So. In any event, thank you, John. I appreciate the contribution and thank you for your service, all who have served. The political wrap-up is something that's very topical at this time, but it's kind of interesting how many people actually have opinions. And I have more than one. They say everyone has one opinion. You have a navel, you have an opinion. But I'd like to introduce Mr. Riley. Mike Riley is a forum member. He's also been honored recently in his profession with the Marshall Award, which is a very high award for service. I'm going to let him introduce himself and talk about his things, but we're all aware of his contributions and services in the community, the public research that he does. And so we have a little style that I have of not wasting their time by saying things about the individuals. Mr. Riley's agreed to go first, and Professor Moore is going to go. I'll offer a few off-the-cuff remarks about Professor Moore, then let him introduce himself also. You gentlemen have control of the time. You have 58 minutes to say whatever you want to, including questions. Take as much time as you want to, recognizing the norms of courtesy, etc. Mr. Riley.
Thank you, John. I think most of you know me. I run a company called Riley Research Associates. I was very pleased to be named the recipient of the William Marsh Award, which is a Lifetime Achievement Award given by the Public Relations Society of America here in the Portland Metro chapter. So that was a thrill, a surprise, and a thrill. Happy to be here with you today, and I always appreciate the opportunity to come and make predictions after the election. Some people were very surprised by what happened. I think one of the overall overwhelming surprises that everyone has is that returning to office is Joe Biden. So that was a shock to Joe and everybody else. We're pleased to see that. Well, I want to talk about a number of things. I want to talk about the national turnout, what people are talking about as the democratic future of the electorate, and then I've got some information about Oregon, how we voted versus the rest of the country, and what I think that means for the future. First of all, in terms of the national turnout, it surprised a lot of people to realize that the turnout was lower this year than it was in 2008. People were expecting a huge turnout based on all the enthusiasm and the excitement, but in some places it was actually even lower than the 2004 election. Some of the reasons for that, people talked about Hurricane Sandy as one possibility, and then there was all this discussion about the enthusiasm factor. The enthusiasm factor was thought to favor the Republicans in this election, but in reality it did not. The Democrats may have been less enthused, but they showed up in higher numbers than the Republicans did. The early voting helped with the turnout as well, especially in some of the places where there were weather problems. Having that early turnout and that vote by mail in Oregon doesn't play as much a role. I mean, we have that, and it affects our turnout to some degree. But across the nation, the early voting opportunities, it did increase turnouts for Democrats. They take advantage of that because the more people vote early, the less the locals have to call and harangue them to get out the vote. So the early voters do help with the turnout in key elections. Parity, it turned out the R's and D's had relative parity in terms of enthusiasm. Although you heard more from the Republicans, the Democrats actually did turn out as they thought they would. One of the interesting articles I read was by a fellow named Sean Trend of Real Clear Politics. He wrote an article last week. It said, "Where are the missing white voters?" Did anybody see that article? What he talked about was the expectation was that minorities were going to be playing a bigger and bigger role in elections. And in fact, in the 2012 election, there wasn't a big turnout, there wasn't a big increase rather in non-white voters, but what there was a significant decline among the percentage of turnout in white voters compared to 2008. A total of nearly 7 million more white voters didn't turn out this time than they did in 2008. So the voters who didn't show up in 2012 were more likely to be white voters compared to non-white voters. In 2008, 75% of the electorate was white. In 2012, only 72% of the electorate was white. But again, that's not because there are more non-white voters, it's because fewer white voters voted by about 7 million. Another thing that was of interest to me in my notes was that Romney actually got 2.5 million fewer votes in 2008 than John McCain got in 2008. So 2,000 fewer votes for Romney in 2012 compared to McCain in 2008. And that was a surprise, that wasn't expected. 125 million votes cast. That was down from about 130 million votes cast in 2008. The explanation for this is as offered by Sean in his article. He said there were a lot of people who were turned off by the negativity of the campaigns. Among Republicans, he thought there were a lot of kind of rural, poor Republicans who were turned off by the characterizations of Romney, his wealth, and that 47% number was thought to have really alienated a lot of the Republican and conservative voters, particularly in the rural areas. And the other thing about Republicans, they said they didn't feel like Romney had made a real clear, positive message about the Republican agenda and what that was going to mean. So those were some of the reasons that they posited for the lower turnout among Romney supporters and white voters in general. So what does all this mean for the future? The Democratic votes, or the Democratic demographic rather, the Democratic makeup of the electorate is changing. There is a growing Latino population. The number of black votes still outnumber the number of Hispanic votes at this point, but the Latino vote is growing and probably will be a larger number than the black vote in the next presidential election. Interestingly, though, comparing at this point, the Latino vote was something like 70% versus 30% for Obama. And the question is, does the Republican Party have an opportunity to win the Latino vote? And there are a number of people out there that think that the Latino vote is not lost to the Republicans at this point, on the basis that there are a lot of issues in which the Republicans align more closely with the Latino voters than the Democrats do. On issues such as pro-life, entrepreneurial issues, and the question is, what are the key reasons why the Hispanic voters tended to go with Obama in this And the number one conclusion that people came to was that it was on immigration issues. The thought that Obama was not going to be the president that was going to eject or deport Latinos, and that Romney was not clear on that issue as to where he would stand and where he would take that. The question of women voters. Obama ran a very strong campaign, as you know, called the War on Women, in which he was able to characterize Romney and the Republican Party in general as a party that didn't care about women's issues. The reality was that single women was the biggest factor for Obama, whereas Obama won a huge percentage of American single women, but Romney actually did better among married women. Married women actually tended to support Romney, well, unmarried women, by a huge percentage, again something like 70 to 30, tended to vote for Obama. So the difference really on the women's issue was among unmarried women compared to married women. So that was a huge issue. The other thing that really cost Republicans was some very stupid remarks by a handful of idiotic senators around the country questioning things like legitimate rape and those kinds of things. So Republicans really stuck their foot in their mouth, and the Democrats really capitalized on those. Back here in Oregon, it was interesting to note, Jeff Mapes wrote an interesting article recently where he talked about the difference between Oregon and America as a whole. For example, some of the stats that he quoted, he said, Obama won 39% of the white vote nationally, but he got 52% of the white vote here in Oregon. Obama got 44% of the votes among people who made 100,000 or more, but he got 62% of the vote among those people here in Oregon. Obama got 55% of the postgraduate degree, the higher educated votes throughout the country, but he got 64% of those votes here in Oregon. So Oregon looks a little different. It's definitely a more liberal country, state, I guess. The characteristics of Oregon voters is different from those of the national voters, but it plays very well for Obama and Democrats in general. Among senior voters, Romney got 56% of the senior vote nationally, but only 52% of the senior voters in Oregon. Obama got 55% of women nationally, but he got 57% of the women voters here in Oregon. So a lot of differences between Oregon and the nation in terms of the characteristics of the vote and who we support. So what does that all bode for the future? I think one of the interesting things I want to conclude with, we did a number of polls on legislative races and on some of the ballot measure races. And the interesting thing I took away from that was, of course, our numbers were very, very close, which you would expect. But the interesting thing was that we did our last ballot testing, we did our last election polls in August and September. And the remarkable thing to me was, despite the frenetic activity and advertising down the stretch, the numbers really did not change. In all the races that I polled, the Democrats had majorities in September, and they maintained those majorities into the election. So the stage was pretty well set in August and September. And even though I think it's widely regarded, and the polls certainly show that Romney got a big bump from his first debate, he made tremendous inroads, and he made it close courtesy of his performance relative to Obama's in that first debate. But he couldn't get it over the top. And the bottom line was that people really pretty much had their minds made up early down the stretch, here in Oregon at least, according to my polls. And the measures that were predicted to win back in as early as August were the ones that did indeed win down the stretch and at the election. So, we're not the kind of voter whose minds are changed by a few fancy ads. We tend to hold on to our votes longer because we think there's a chance that some other shoe might drop or some scandal might break. But the reality is most of us had our minds made up back in August and September, and it's going to be interesting to note in the future that if you don't have your campaign established and you don't have your positions established early, there's very little chance you have of changing people's votes down the stretch, barring some incredible announcement or some huge scandal breaking. So that's my take on the election. Things came off actually pretty much as they were predicted. Obama had been given 2-to-1 odds by most of the odds makers back as early as August and September. And even though Romney made tremendous inroads as of the first debate, he really wasn't able to change the game, change the playing field, and things kind of unfolded the way they were predicted to unfold, despite all the frenetic activity and despite all the interest that people had down the stretch. Things were pretty much the way they were expected to be, and that's the way they turned out. So now we're going to hear from Jim Moore, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Moore is a political science professor at Pacific. He also is involved in a lot of political things. He's that interesting academic who's also involved in the practical world. He's also my son's professor, and my son deigned to, over the wrestling tournament at the universities on the Pacific University wrestling team, deigned to drop a few tidbits. But Professor Moore, I thank you for your time here, and we're going to open, when we do the questions, we're going to abrogate a little time limit rule a little bit, since most of the questions were based upon opinion anyway, so I will not be kicking people off unless the question exceeds 45 seconds to a minute. Professor, be ready, because we're going to have questions coming up after your presentation.
Well, it's good to be with you all again. We seem to meet after elections a lot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the tactics. We decided Mike would give kind of the high view about what was going on with polling and the numbers and things like that. I just want to reemphasize something that he said. We had in this country 9 states where the presidential election took place this year. If you look at a map of where the presidential candidates went after the conventions, they only went to those 9 states, and then in the last couple of weeks, all of a sudden they went to Pennsylvania. That was it. Remember, Oregon in 2004 was one of those states. But it looks like we're shifting so that we're not going to be one of those states for quite some time at this point. But it was just phenomenal. And in all of those states, for everything that went on, just reemphasizing what Mike said, the polls showed an even race that kind of leaned to Obama back in August and September. And lo and behold, in all of those states except North Carolina, Obama won. So it was remarkable, even with the up and down from the first debate. All of a sudden, more Republicans in Texas were more enthusiastic about Romney, and that swayed national numbers. But in the battleground states, things didn't move at all. It was just stunning. So if you're thinking about investing, where did your $2.8 billion go from the Obama campaign and the Romney campaign to those states, and what did it do? It left things the status quo that we saw basically at the end of the summer. It was rather stunning. Meanwhile, back here at the ranch, here's what happened. So we got the presidential race. Did anybody see a Romney campaign in Oregon? No. Yeah, I thought so. It was amazing. Even 4 years ago, when McCain wasn't given much chance here, there were some people in Beaverton who opened up their houses to invite people over to sit there with their cell phones and go through call lists and call people. Romney campaign, nothing. Absolutely nothing this time. The Obama campaign, not quite as strong as it was last time, but they had all those people on the ground in all sorts of places. Many of my students were volunteering for the Obama campaign. There was no Romney campaign for them to volunteer for. And so working basically on registration up until the deadline in Oregon, and then turnout after that. That's what they were doing. And my students also got a lesson in kind of national politics. After the registration deadline in Oregon, the Obama people looked at their internal polls, and most of their high-paid staff left Oregon and went to Colorado, one of the battleground states, because that's where they really needed the people on the ground to get the turnout and get the result that they wanted. So when you look at that, well, that's fine. So here in the state, we've got Obama 54%, Romney 43%. Washington County, a little bit more blue, 57% to 40%. Okay? I compared that with Clackamas. Obama won in Clackamas, but 50% to 47%. So kind of 3% in on either side there. So, there we go. The turnout, this is as of last Thursday night, because we haven't basically caught up since then. 1.69 million voters. That's down a little bit from where we were 4 years ago. We'll wait and see, votes are going to be trickling in for the next few weeks. But we're going to be down at where we were 4 years ago, but we're about 400,000 more than we were 2 years ago. And that's going to become important when you look at the state legislative races, and here in Washington County, we were at the core of those state legislative races. It was higher turnout and the Democrats matching the Republicans in turnout percentages that caused those results. So higher turnout and Democrats turning out at the same amount. Let's look at some of the other races. So what other races do we have? Geez Louise. Statewide races, we had the snoozers of the century. We had an attorney general race. Who did the Republicans put up? Oh wait, they didn't run anybody in the primary. And so we had a write-in person. We had a treasurer's race. Who did the Republicans put up? Oh wait, they didn't run anybody in the primary. So we had a write-in person. Secretary of State. Geez, we did have a Republican. Newt Bueller. I love that campaign. It was Kate Brown, KB versus Newt Bueller, KB. It was the KB Fest. It was great. Newt Bueller spent $1 million. They had fights over how much money you should spend. And here were the results. 51% for Brown, 43% for Bueller. Looking at that, he spent $1 million to basically not get much. It was a campaign that I kept waiting to happen. In the middle of October, I had the Secretary of State candidates out to Pacific for a forum. Kate Brown refused to show up. That's fine. So we had Newt Bueller, we had the Pacific Green Party guy, and we had the Progressive Party guy. They were great. They did all sorts of things. Newt Bueller walks in. I've never met him before. He introduces himself, saying, "Hey, how are we doing?" At that point, I said, well, it's pretty quiet. There is no campaign here in Washington County that I can see except a few signs. That's your campaign. You do know that to win the state, you must win Washington County. You must make inroads into Multnomah County. And he nodded and said, oh, we're on that. And I thought to myself, where? I haven't seen anything. That campaign started the day the ballots came out. All of a sudden, he had ads on television. But at that point, people simply didn't know who he was, and he was going through the whole process of introducing himself to the crucial electorate, getting the word out about why we should have change, all in a very short time period, and it simply didn't work. Now, it wasn't just here. I grew up in Southern Oregon, and so I was talking to my connections in Jackson County. Jackson County, strong Republican base. Even they, as they went to the ballot, said, who is Newt Bueller? He wasn't even spending money that got him known in the Republican parts of the state. So I don't know what he was spending his money on, but it didn't work. Now that he got 43.5% of the vote. Well, how well does that do? Well, let's compare him to, let's see here, Attorney General. Remember Attorney General? We had Ellen Rosenblum, Dwight Holton, great Democratic primary. No Republicans, remember. After the primary, Ellen Rosenblum won by a lot. We were kind of surprised at that. And oddly enough, John Kitzhaber appointed her to be the Attorney General because Kroger was leaving. So she's running as an incumbent, more or less. Republicans have a write-in candidate. So James Buechel, he came here, didn't he? No, he didn't come. Okay. Well, that's part of his issue. It's like, what campaign did he run? He ended up getting 39% of the vote for a candidate who basically wasn't there. Newt Bueller spent $1 million and got 4.5% more turnout. That's it. So the Republicans still have the same issue that they've had now for a long time. If you're going to run statewide candidates, you've got to run statewide candidates who have the name recognition or can build it. Newt Bueller simply didn't build it. And who can run campaigns wisely, unlike, remember 2 years ago when Chris Dudley all of a sudden was taking bus trips off in Central and Eastern Oregon, he had to come here. This is where the Blazer fan base was. He had to spend his time here and break in there. He didn't do it. We've got to have Republican candidates who will campaign wisely, get over 30% of the vote in Multnomah County. Win Washington County. Even if you win by 1 vote, you're going to be doing a lot better. And we just didn't see that in this particular election. When we look at the treasurer's race, Tom Cox, local Washington County guy, how did he do? He lost 58 to 37% statewide. Here in Washington County, we only gave him 36% of our votes. Being the hometown boy didn't help him at all. Okay. So statewide, snoozers, but when we saw kind of an effort by the Republicans in the Secretary of State race, it just didn't go anywhere. It didn't go anywhere. And to add into that, basically every newspaper except one, I think the Portland Mercury, came out and endorsed Kate Brown, but everybody else endorsed Newt Buehler. I did an interview with somebody at the Bend Bulletin right after they endorsed Buehler, which is his hometown, you'd expect that. And they also looked around and said, wow, look at all these endorsements. Here's the dirty little thing that we in political science and media studies look at. People don't read the endorsements. Those who do are what we call opinion leaders, and they will talk to people at groups like this, at church, wherever. They'll talk to people and spread the word, but people weren't excited about Newt Buehler. They didn't really know who he was, and they didn't really have a reason to talk, to make that spread happen from those few people who read the endorsements to spread it out to other people who might go out and vote. So it was very kind of, it'll be interesting for textbooks, but in terms of excitement, not much. Then we had the labor commissioner race, pitting the best of Washington County against each other. Brad Avakian from the hills, Bruce Starr from the kind of other hills. Everybody was getting ready to go there. You may remember this, about 10 days before the election, there was some polling done that said 60% of the people in the state basically had no idea who these guys were. Another really quiet race. So here's what happened. When we look out there, Avakian wins 52.5%, Starr 47%. I put the 0.5% in there because it becomes crucial. In the Battle of Washington County, the Washington County boys, Avakian 53 to 46. So there we go. Now here's why I put the 0.5% in there. If we look at the other statewide races, there's an undervote. And the undervote is the difference between those who vote for president and those who vote for the lower level offices. 100,000 to 130,000 fewer people voted for attorney generals, treasurer, that kind of thing, than the presidential race. In the labor commissioner race, the undervote was 440,000. In those other statewide races, there are write-in candidates. And the write-in candidates are kind of 1,200 to about 2,500. And it's people who are frustrated, want to write in somebody. The write-in vote for the labor commissioner was 7,000. People got in there, they looked at this race and they said, what on earth? And they skipped it, or they said, I don't know who either of these people are, I'll vote in whoever. In Sweden, they're required to vote by law, and so actually the #1 write-in candidate is Donald Duck, and has been for 50 years. I don't know if we get that here in Oregon. They actually don't even look at the write-ins unless it makes a difference in Oregon. But it basically shows that voters didn't really learn who these candidates were when they got to casting their ballots, basically said, why should I vote, and off they went. Okay? So those are the statewide races. We'll get to some of the ballot measures here in a bit. They also were incredibly exciting, but there's something we need to pay attention to for 2014, marijuana, for instance. But let's get to the heart of the matter here in Washington County. We had legislative races. Yahoo! So there were about 9 state legislative races that we were looking for control of the House. The assumption was that there might be some Oregon Senate races which would change the way that the control was there, the party control there, but probably not. And if there was going to be change, it'd be a 1-for-1, so we basically still have Democratic control. So the Oregon House was it. Split 30-30, what was going to happen? So we look around, and of those 9 races, about 6 or 7, depending on how you count, are basically right around the Portland metro area. And so it's either first-term Republicans who were defending, or it was people who were leaving and there was an open seat. And so we were looking at all those. And the people who were leaving an open seat were basically replaced by the same party, so no big deal there. But 4 of the first-term Republicans were defeated. When I was looking at it, and I don't have Mike's polling, I just kind of have seat of the pants and whatever leaks out, I suspected that the Democrats would probably pick up at least 2 seats. And the reason was simply turnout. Once again, higher turnout than 2010, and if there's more of an equal turnout between the Republicans and the Democrats. And I knew the Democrats would be within a couple of percentage points in turnout. They were a few points behind that in percentage turnout compared to the Republicans in 2010, and so I thought maybe 2. Well, about 8:20 we got the first numbers, and 8:45 we kind of had the second set of numbers, and I went down and looked, and there I was sitting at Coin, where we had Scott Pelley. Boy, if you watch CBS, isn't Scott Pelley like the most boring anchor person you've ever seen in your life? Just saying. He's like Dan Rather's voice without the witticisms about it's closer than a bug under a dog's collar or something like that. But looking at it, it was all of a sudden stunningly clear that the Democrats have actually picked up 4 seats. And at least 2 of them were going to hold up. 2 of them were pretty close, and we wanted to wait to see if more votes were going to come in. So by gosh, we put something together to go on the air, and then all of a sudden, Romney was conceding, and Obama was winning, and so we didn't really get to go on with anything fancy. It was just running on the bottom. But they lost. Those first-term Republicans lost. And when we look at it, you can look at the way they campaigned, and you can look at turnout as kind of the 2 big things. I had students who were in the Iyer-Unger race on both sides, and I had students who were in the Gallegos and Lindsay race, just on the Gallegos side. It's a little farther out, so you have to have more committed people to make it all the way into Hillsborough for Forest Grove. And in both of those races, we saw some interesting dynamics in how they ran the race. In the Unger-Iyer race, we had Unger, who was really good at getting volunteers and having people on the ground. Those people knocked on a lot of doors. I had one student who worked in the primary and then came and kept working in the general election, and he knocked on the same doors 7 times. By the 4th time, people were answering the door and saying, "You've been here, go away." But the literature in the academic fields, when you study this, and what people sense when they're out doing this is, if you knock on their doors, they're going to turn in their ballots. Even if they're ticked off, they're going to turn in their ballots. Ideally, just to get you to not knock on their doors anymore. And so Unger was really good at that. He also had people in his campaign who spoke Spanish as a first language. And they went into the heavily Latino areas around Cornelius and parts of Hillsborough, and they knocked on doors. They were culturally sensitive in the way they did that. They did all that kind of stuff and made a big connection with people. Now, I don't know that we're going to have good enough polling to be able to tell if there was a bigger Latino turnout, but it was something that was a direct strategy and tactic by the younger people, and I suspect that it had an effect, at least in telling the Latino population, you're part of this system, come into it, you're welcoming. Here's an anecdotal piece of evidence that showed that that worked. At the Forest Grove Library on election day, there were a number of Latino families coming in where the parents did not speak English, their kids were being interpreters, which is pretty common, and the kids were asking the librarians, where is the drop-off box, where do we turn in our ballots? And that's never happened at the Forest Grove Library before. So something was going on. The Iyer campaign didn't have as much of an on-the-ground presence. They had a lot of volunteers, but not quite as many. They relied more on mailings, and those mailings, you get them. I have a stack of them. A friend of mine at Pacific is going to be teaching a class on political psychology. I've got all my mailers for her. So from gill netting to why Obama is the best person to the worst person, I've got them all for her. She relied more on the mailers. But this then ended up being a problem for her. There were independent mailings that came from the Republican Party in Salem, which attacked Ben Unger. And they were conflated with what Katie Iyer was running on. And so she had to go out and say, well, you can't say, I didn't approve of that. You just have to kind of live with it, but it complicated her message. And she didn't have as many people out there knocking on doors to go out and personally say, this is what's really going on. Katie Iyer herself went and knocked on doors for weeks. It was amazing, but she just didn't have as many volunteers out there. So looking at that, I thought that Unger was going to win, coupled with the fact that we were going to have that higher turnout. and that Democrats and Republicans would be about equal in terms of the way that they turned out. Now, over in the Lindsay Gallegos race, it was a little bit more mysterious. Joe Gallegos, I worked with him at the University of Portland for years. He was an adjunct out at Pacific last year. Joe Gallegos turned out to be not that good a candidate. He wasn't very good at answering questions on specifics about what he was thinking of. When he went into the endorsement interviews in newspapers, he kept saying, well, everything's on the table. Well, what's on the table? But in this kind of a race where turnout was higher, where the Democratic advantage in the district is emphasized because of equal turnout between Republicans and Democrats, he also won by a lesser amount than Ben Unger did, but he also won. And so now, I mean, once again, I've known him for years. He'll be an extremely good advocate for the issues that he cares about down in Salem. He's Hispanic. You know, I don't know that that was that big a deal in terms of getting him elected, but he'll be a voice for that. Sean Lindsay got had basically by higher voter turnout. Sean Lindsay was someone who was a pretty active social conservative Republican and went to Salem and within days found out, whoops, you can't act like that and get anything done. And Sean Lindsay became a pretty effective legislator down in Salem. But that didn't translate to the voters, partly because we really don't know what our legislators do down in Salem, and partly because with a rising tide of Democratic turnout, he just was the wrong party. He just was the wrong party. Notice the subtext in all of this. In 2014, Republicans could take these seats back. Lower turnout, higher percentage of Republicans turning out, they could easily go the other way. But for now, high turnout really drove everything. Now, just a little bit on the ballot measures. Oh wait, no, two more things on the legislature. First of all, the dog that didn't bark. You may recall that stories broke last year, well this year, last January, a number of Oregon House Republicans went to a topless bar in Palm Springs. No one seemed to use that in the campaigns. So there we go, that was nice. Secondly, the person who was not on the ballot but tried to be on the ballot, Andrew Miller, Stimson Lumber. Okay, he's got his Oregon Transformation Project. It was focused on Clackamas County, where his candidates did win. And so Clackamas County will go do whatever Clackamas County does. Does anybody want to volunteer to be on their water bureau? Just saying. But here in Washington County, he put a lot of money behind Manuel Castañeda in Beaverton against Jeff Barker. And Jeff won 60 to 40%, so that wasn't a very good use of money. And Dan Mason got money in the district that comes over the hills with Chris Harker in it. And Dan Mason lost 36 to 64%. And so Andrew Miller wants to change the world with his money, but he needs to kind of put it where it's going to make a difference, and I'd suggest Clackamas County rather than here. Statewide measures. Washington County was pretty much in line with the state. The state, when we looked at ending the corporate kicker, we voted to do that. Ending the inheritance tax. You know, that was the one that I thought would pass easily. There wasn't really any campaign one way or the other in that, and we voted to keep the inheritance tax. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting one. And then the ban the real estate transfer taxes. Remember, Washington County is grandfathered in. We're the only county that has real estate transfer taxes. So what was the statewide result? Yes, repeal the transfer taxes, 59%, no, 41%. In Washington County, yes, repeal the transfer tax that we have and will stay, 59% to 41%. I'd love to have been able to have basically polling that went that deep. But did people in Washington County realize that we have this thing and it's not going away? It was weird. It was very weird. Now, here's the last one to talk about, marijuana. And the reason we need to talk about marijuana is it passed in Washington, a version passed in Washington State, and because of that, we're going to look for a 2014 ballot measure on marijuana of some kind. Now, remember, there were two marijuana measures. The one that was closest to what Washington State passed did not make the ballot. And that's why the person behind that actually signed up to run against Kate Brown as Secretary of State. Okay, Bob Wolf was behind that. And so the one that we had didn't attract the national money because the wording of it and the way it was going to go about things was not what the national money really wanted to see as the ideal marijuana measure. Whereas in Colorado and in Washington, they got that. Okay, so we're going to see a version of that come here. So here's the statewide result. Personal use of marijuana, we had 46% yes, 54% no, so it fails. Washington County, about the same. We're actually 43% yes, 57% no, so we're a little more anti-marijuana there. Multnomah County, 60% yes, 40% no. That's where the battle is right there. There was an article in the Oregonian in the past week that talked about the marijuana culture in Southern Oregon. I grew up in Southern Oregon. I know Southern Oregon, and there ain't no marijuana culture in Southern Oregon. How do I know that? They went and looked at the numbers per 1,000 who had medical marijuana cards. But even if you get up to 200 per 1,000, that's still only 20%, and they got up to about 40 per 1,000 or 30 per 1,000 in terms of higher numbers. Here's what Josephine County did on the marijuana measure: 40% yes, 60% no. The marijuana culture said, this ain't it. We don't want this thing. Marijuana is going to be on the ballot in 2014 in some form. Gay marriage is going to be on the ballot in 2014 in some form. There will be a lot of excitement. We are, for instance, going to have the first openly gay female Speaker of the House in Oregon. She's not the first openly gay Speaker of the House simply because Colorado's legislature met last week and voted in their new speaker who's gay. So as of last Thursday, Colorado beat Oregon to have the first openly gay Speaker of the House. So there we go. We have our first openly gay member of the U.S. Senate from Wisconsin, who was also the first openly gay member of the U.S. House before she went to the Senate. So there's change happening there, but remember, the turnout in 2014 will be lower. There will probably be, if we've got strong candidates, we've seen at the legislative level that it happens every time, the Republicans come up with good legislative candidates for those House races. They're going to draw more Republicans as a percentage to vote than Democrats. Quite frankly, if I were running either the marijuana campaign or the gay marriage campaign, I'd put it off until 2016. But we're going to see these. They're going to come. They're going to be here. Okay? So that's a rundown. Now, Mike and I will be up here as tag team, and we'll start with questions.
That's correct. And all questions are open to forum members only. I'm going to allow a little more opinion because we have a little more time for them. Again, the Public Affairs Forum craves opinion. We seek it, but we'd like to have it succinct and to the point. Forum members?
I'm Barbara Wilson. I'm a member of the forum. Could you tell me, because I've puzzled over this greatly, what are the major factors that would persuade a person to be either a Republican or a Democrat?
Do you want to weigh in on that?
No.
Okay, here we go. I will jump into the abyss. The number one reason that people choose their party is their parents. That's it. And most people choose what their parents were, or they go exactly the opposite direction. A small number do. Okay? And so when you look at, for instance, I grew up in a Republican household. I mean, my family has been Republican back to Abraham Lincoln. And in my lifetime here, I first was registered as a Republican, and then I went to be a Democrat, and then I said, geez, none of this is working out. I'm unaffiliated. And how do unaffiliateds vote? They tend to vote what they used to be. They're ticked off at one party or another. But the motivation comes down to, what's your worldview? So in the past 30 or 40 years, what are your view on social issues is going to drive which party you're going to go to. So women's issues, gay rights, all those kinds of things are going to drive where you want to go. It used to be that it was almost purely economic, but the economics is actually getting a little bit gray. It generally now comes down to how you feel about taxes, not necessarily about the economy and how the economy is run. And so you go where you go. You've all watched the change in the Republican Party in Oregon, going from basically run by moderates to being run by more conservatives on the social and the fiscal side. This has caused not so much a change in the registration, although for the past 15 years, more people who are new voters register as unaffiliated than either Republican or Democrat. But it's mean that people, for instance, of my parents' age, have had to do a lot of soul searching. Am I still a Republican? Because it's gone away that they weren't comfortable with in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So it's basically the social issues and economy, and tax becomes crucial now. And that's it. That's it. When I talk to my students, I've got Republicans and Democrats. There are actually Republican college students. I've got Republicans and Democrats, and when they ask about that, I say, so what are your parents? And so far, that's 100% the determinant of what they are. Just like that. If they're going to change, it's going to be because they see something happen. For instance, when Ronald Reagan became president and the party seemed to go more to the right, a lot of people in the Republican Party were doing soul searching. And some of it took like a decade or so to change. But it takes a lot to change off of where your parents were, basically.
I weigh in a little bit on that too. I think there's a pretty clear sense that the brand of the Republican Party has been tarnished. The Republican Party used to be for the little guy, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln. And so I think the Democrats have done a very effective job as painting the Republicans as social conservatives, concerned more about what goes on with women's body and women's rights than really the fiscal issues. Republicans used to be known as the fiscal conservatives, people who cared about budgets, cared about international, national defense and those kinds of things. But the Republicans have allowed their image to be tarnished. And I don't think it's as cool to be a Republican as it may have once been. Maybe that's a bit of an understatement. And so, as Jim said, a lot of people who were Republicans have shifted to independent status. And in fact, looking at the outcome of the election to a great degree, the way the ballots came out, where the elections and the races came out, largely it was won by, the majority who won by the percentage of Democrat vote versus the percentage of Republican and independent vote combined. So Republicans need the independents to have a hope or a prayer, but they need to burnish their image, because right now that image is very tarnished, especially here in Oregon.
I'm Emily Knupp. I'm a member. I'm a lifetime Democrat. I got robocalls from the Mitt Romney campaign almost daily for 3 weeks. I have no idea why. My question is, what effect did the redistricting have on the changes in the legislature, mostly the House races?
I'm aware of a few of them. In one case, Patrick Sheehan from Clackamas County, he suffered a fatal change in his electoral turnout. He had like a 7-point switch from the level of support that he had to the ultimate, and the turnout tended to reflect those ratios. So, in the case of several of the Republicans who lost percentages in the redistricting, it cost them dearly. At least that's my perception, Jim.
Remember, this redistricting, while there were a few districts that were shifted big like that, most of them were actually tinkering with what Bill Bradbury did in 2000. And so my favorite district is still one that starts just north of Medford, goes over the Cascades, and ends up in Bend. It's like, oh, well, there's a district that's easy to cover. And that didn't get fixed. That's still there. And so when we look at it, there was a little bit of change. For instance, the Washington County districts saw maybe a 2%, 3% change in Democrats or Republicans, but not much. So the districting, except in those extreme cases, didn't seem to make that much change when we look at it as an overall.
Practically a farm member, the Republicans have driven out the moderates out of their party and everything else, and they've made more fringe. Do you see a chance of third party rising nationally?
No. and here's why. Anybody know what the most successful third party is in U.S. history? No? The Republican Party. The Republican Party drove the Whigs out of business, okay? But the Republican Party did it with the two things you've got to have to make a third party work. You've got to have an issue that galvanizes people. Slavery seemed to be that issue. You've got to have a candidate that can carry that banner. And that's where Abraham Lincoln came in and carried that banner. We've seen other groups. I mean, Ross Perot had the issue, but it wasn't clear how many people really cared about the deficit that much. And then his personality, he just went nuts. So that kind of went away. Colin Powell, what would he do? So the personality, but what on earth was his issue? I'm not quite happy with where the Republican Party is. That's not really an issue. So you got to have both. And at this point, clearly there are a lot of disaffected voters, but you don't have anything to unify them, the issue, and you don't have the person to step in to be the face of whatever that is. So I just don't see it happening for quite some time.
Bill Kroger, a forum member. I was wondering if you'd spend a moment talking about money and the politics. You know, we have some new dynamics this time. Nationally, they got hammered, but I don't probably see it going away. But I was just wondering if you see it coming back and affecting when there's less turnout in 2 years, for example, these kind of races. Also, statewide, Kevin Mannix, I think, had outside money to support his tax issue, and I was wondering if you see that increasing or how.
Well, I think Jim pretty aptly pointed out that a lot of money was invested rather poorly in this election, and that's from the national on down. It had very little impact on the outcome. So, yeah, money can have an impact, particularly if you don't have it. It's one of those things that if you don't have it, you're going to get killed. If you have money, you at least have a chance. But I don't know. There were also questions about whether people used money effectively or not, or whether they were willing to tackle the issues that could have made a difference. For example, in the labor commissioner race, there were a number of people that were telling Bruce Starr that he really needed to go negative. Look at how Suzanne Bonamici defeated Brad Avakian in the primary. She crushed him. She brought up issues about him not paying taxes, not paying his debts. There were very, very strong negative campaign run against Brad Avakian in the primary by Suzanne Bonamici very effectively. So I don't think it was as much about money, but it's about finding the issues that resonate with the right people and using your money to articulate those issues effectively. And I don't think that was done very well in this election.
Just a little extra thing you asked about Kevin Mannix. Kevin Mannix out-of-state money has kind of dried up and then kind of started up again. Basically involves what's happening in the economy in Nevada, as far as I can tell. We have seen that happen time and again in Oregon. We have waves when ballot measures are out there, and when they're out there, outside money comes in, and then the outside money says, we keep losing, if we're going to invest, let's invest it in a different way. That might be for state legislative races, that might be city council races, something other like that. At the national level, we're going to see people doing soul searching, because when you look at the congressional races and the presidential races, that's $6 billion. And what happened? You got the same president, you basically have the same breakdown in both the Senate and the House. And so I think at the national level, we're going to see people looking in there and saying, how do we, if we want to be involved, how do we invest and make a difference here? And for that, here clearly Karl Rove had his ideas a bit tarnished, partly by his own behavior on Fox on election night, but partly because he was the biggest outside money funnel, and what he put his money to didn't work. He basically had a success rate of about 15 to 20%. And so are people going to give money to him to put out there again? In Oregon, we've seen it takes about 3 or 4 years for that cycle to go through. What will it be at the national? We'll watch.
Bill Foster, forum member. What can the Republicans do to win the next presidential election?
First of all, you got to figure out what a Republican is. The Republican Party is, and we've seen it, I talked about this with you guys 4 years ago, the evangelical vote is no longer the center of the Republican Party. That's part of the reason why John McCain didn't win in 2008. It's clearly part of the reason why Mitt Romney didn't win now. So here's the big issues. I can, for instance, foresee kind of regional Republican parties getting together. The South, social issues. That's it. And when you look at the South, boy, the Republicans did incredibly well. They got rid of the last vestiges of Democrats in the governorship and parts of the legislature throughout the South. But it was social issues that were the key thing. Intermountain West and West Coast, it's fiscal issues that really define what the Republican Party is. And so the National Republican Party has got to figure out what it's about. I think there's more of a future in economics than there is in social issues, but they've got to figure that out. Secondly, you've got to have a candidate that basically has the support of the Republican Party. Here's the funniest thing that I heard during this entire election. The talking heads on the Republican networks, radio and television, basically say Mitt Romney isn't really a Republican. Mitt Romney had clearly won the Republican Party's base in primary after primary after primary, but the talking heads who thought they knew better said, oh, we know better than our own people in the Republican Party. And so we've got to have the Republican Party has basically got to get those together to get behind the candidates. Here was the practical result of that. In states where there were battleground issues going on, Iowa, Colorado, those kinds of places, Mitt Romney basically got no help from the National Republican Party or local Republicans who supported other candidates in the primaries. He had to start in this summer building his ground game from the bottom up. In all of those states, Obama had left the people who were there in 2008, and they were there ready to go, and he had the full support of all the Democratic Party, and so they were able to out-organize him in every battleground state. Mitt Romney was basically left hanging to dry by the Republican establishment in those states. And so we've got to get a candidate that basically unifies the party, even if you didn't support him in the primary. We're at a place now where there's just too many shots being taken.
Yeah, Bill, if I could add a couple of things. The other thing, I think the big question mark for Republicans right now is the Latino vote. And people argue, people say Republicans are the natural constituency of the Latino vote. They tend to be religious people, they tend to be pro-life, they tend to be very industrious, entrepreneurial, a natural constituency for Republicans. But I think the immigration issue is killing the Republicans at this point. Republicans are saying, stop immigration, build a fence. I think if they want to say build a fence, but let's talk about immigration. Let's find a way to make sure that Latinos in this country don't feel like their houses are going to be raided by INS agents. That's the first thing they have to do to win over the Latino vote. And I think they have a chance. They got about 30% of the Latino vote, and I think Republicans can do much better with that group. And then as Jim said, the on-the-ground effort, the get-out-the-vote effort is so much more sophisticated among the Democrats, and not just because they started in 2008, but they've built it. They've got a high-tech, on-the-ground effort that's got enthusiasm and lots of volunteers, and a lot of inherent support from unions and others. And finally, I think the Republicans have to find a way to talk directly with the American people, as opposed to relying on the media to get their message out. And that's one of the reasons why I think Mitt Romney did so well in the first debate. So many of the people were seeing Mitt Romney face-to-face for the first time on national television. Without any filters, without any interruptions, he was being able to project who he is to the American people, and it worked really well for him.
Marilyn McWilliams, Tualatin Valley Water District Commissioner, and I wanted to ask both of you, it seems like in many states there was a lot of controversy over voting, whether people could vote, you know, when the polls were open and so on. Do you think that there will be any kind of national interest now in the mail-in ballot?
That's interesting. I think that's going to be a story item for a long time to come. There's going to be lots of research done about how voting was done. There was early voting in a number of states for the first time that wasn't very well organized. I think that actually did cost some votes and some turnout because they weren't ready for them. They were talking about 3- and 4-hour waits at some of the early voting places. So I think that is going to be an issue. Voter fraud is going to continue to be an issue. The question of ID, having to show ID to vote, is going to continue to be an issue. So that's going to be a very important issue between now and the next election.
You know, vote by mail, we've been doing it, love it. I went to graduate school in Cook County, Illinois. They would never trust the U.S. Post Office to deliver your ballot. And so there are cultural things that go on as well. Here's something that's key to remember in this. There is no national right to vote. Our Constitution does not have a right to vote. It says states are the place where the right to vote takes place. And all the stuff about women having the right to vote and African Americans having the right to vote basically says states can't prevent those people from registering to vote. We have 51 voting systems. DC also gets electoral college votes. And as long as we've got those 51 systems, we're going to have 51 issues like this. Oregon, and especially upper Midwest, I mean, the people in Minnesota love to have clean elections and higher turnout than we do and all that stuff. It's going to be a regional kind of thing, and you know, that's just the way it is. Other countries look at our voting system and say, you guys are nuts. And they have a single national system where everybody registers the same way. You can move and your registration goes with you automatically, but we just aren't going to do that because it's a states' rights issue.
Virginia Bruce, forum member. It seems to me like most the local and state issues and candidates have a greater influence on everybody's lives than the national races. And I've also found that participation in local politics helps keep you sane, where trying to participate in national politics makes you crazy. What can we do to get rid of that undervote and to encourage people to spend a little bit of time thinking about their local and state issues?
As a teacher, may I simply say education. But you're exactly right. When you look at the things that are your daily life, it's your property taxes, it's the quality of the roads, it's the schools, it's all that kind of stuff. And what happens in Syria tomorrow, and what exactly happened in Benghazi, Libya, and what's going to happen if those over $250,000 have their taxes tweaked. It's just not part of our lives, and it's not going to have a huge impact on our lives. It's been a problem since the beginning of the country, and it's going to continue to be a problem because we focus on the big stuff, and we just don't pay attention to what's our actual impact on our actual lives.
And I'm going to push back on that a little bit because I think the Affordable Care Act is something that will affect us locally to a great degree. So I think there are both national and local issues, and traditionally it's been the pocketbook issues that have come home to roost locally. I mean, I think that's maybe why some of us live in Washington County, because we don't want Multnomah County's property taxes. So there are pocketbook issues that have a great impact locally, but there are national issues that affect people as well.
Lee Coleman, forum member. Now, neither one of you nor any of the national analysts touched on lying as part of the campaign.
That's not true.
And, well, I'm looking for your answer, Mike, and Mike, I want to know what polling you did that shows the effect of Romney's serial lying, and I'd love to have your commentary on lying as a mode of politics, Jim. So what did the polling show?
Well, credibility has always been one of the key factors of a candidate and whether or not somebody supports candidates, whether they think that candidate has credibility. That said, lying is a great American tradition when it comes to political campaigns.
Oh, yes.
So, and you know, whether one candidate said more egregious things than other, I think both of them are thought to be saying things that could be regarded as egregious. The war on women. How many of you felt like there was a war on women going on? Okay, a couple of you. No men. Several women thought that. Okay, John, yeah, John counts. But so it happens on both sides. The nature of our First Amendment says that free speech, and particularly free political speech, is an absolute right. So candidates run the risk of being foisted on their own petards if they say things that are blatantly untrue, can be shown to be untrue. So I think we have to let the American system, free speech, work its way out, and the voters have to judge for themselves who's telling the truth, and you can judge for yourself as to whether that's the way this worked out this time.
Just 2 quick points here. First of all, each of us has a partisan identity, and when we hear lies that favor what we want, we buy into them. It's just that simple. And so in the debates, when we hear all the half-truths and lies and things, man, if you're an Obama supporter or a Romney supporter, you go, yeah! Or if you're the other side, you go, you lie! Okay, so that's one thing. Second thing, this gets a little bit into negative campaigning. Negative campaigning is around because it works. It moves voters. And even if you just need to move a few, the key thing, though, is timing and a message that won't, as Mike said, blow back in your face, and people will say, oh, you made that up. That was not quite to that extent, but that was part of the issue that Katie Iyer had in her race. There were some things said about Ben Unger in mailings, independent mailings, and she wasn't really able to disassociate herself from them and say, hey, that's not exactly where I am. So they're effective, that's the key thing.
Kathy Stanton, forum member. Mike, when in your first part of your presentation, you did some demographic information. I would really like to know the age demographics, under over 40. Is any data on that, any polling on that to say how many under 40s voted as opposed to all of us who started young and won't stop voting?
Well, I haven't looked at any post-election analysis on that, Kathy, but I can tell you that pre-election there was some analysis done that suggested that younger voters weren't registering at the same rate as they were in 2008. There was a big gap in the 18 to 22-year-old, I think, segment of the population. Not near as many as the very young people were signing up to vote or registering to vote. And that's one of the things I think that gave Republicans false hope, is that they thought there are not as many young, enthusiastic voters who tend to be Democratic. But that didn't turn out to be impactful, because more of the older voters, middle to older voters, did actually show up. And as Jim said, they voted in relative same proportions. So when that happens, that's always going to favor the Democrats. So younger voters, I think they remain engaged, but you didn't see the level of engagement you saw for Obama in 2008. And that could have more to do with kind of the reality of the charisma. You know, Obama had so much charisma in 2008 and so many loyal followers. Wasn't quite the same this time around. I think young voters are here to stay. And certainly as this bulge of senior voters starts to pass, the younger voters are going to come to take their place. There is a lot of activity, but I'm not aware that there is a bulge of the youngest of voters, particularly since 2008.
We're going to keep going live, but the Public Affairs Forum is terminating its television coverage. Washington County Public Affairs Forum meets from 11:45 to 1 o'clock at the old Spaghetti Factory, and we welcome members, encourage it, and cherish them. So this is us signing off. We're going to continue with the questions. Auditor Hutzler.
John Hutzler, forum member. I heard a speaker this weekend, and I'd be interested in your take on the points that he was making. He remarked about the number of groups that claim responsibility for Obama's victory in this election, including women, African Americans, the unions, the LGBT community, Hispanics, and he said, in fact, they're all right. That significant shifts in any one of those groups could have changed the result of this election, at least in terms of the national numbers. And said that while change will take time, he sees this as kind of a tipping point where the politics of hate and fear will no longer work effectively in campaigns because candidates cannot afford to alienate any of these groups whose votes could make a difference in an election where the white majority is relatively evenly split. Do you see that as an outcome of this election, that we may get away from that kind of a campaign toward campaigns that have to appeal to the American public as a community?
No. In a word, no. Obama made very effective use of single women. 70-30 split for Obama. Huge, huge split. He made very effective use of the Latino voter as well. 70-30 split. So I think to the extent that candidates see target-rich opportunities such as those, they're going to do everything they can to do whatever it takes to divide those and get the results that they wanted. So that's exactly what Obama did. He recognized that he had an opportunity to win over a large share of a small segment, several small segments. So the idea of all working together as one, I don't think it's in the political strategery, if you will.
Yeah, I agree totally. Remember, we have in this country basically umbrella parties. We don't have the focused parties that they have in Europe. And these umbrellas are coalitions. That's just the nature of them. And so the coalitions shift who's in, who's out. We're clearly at a tipping point in terms of the role of white voters. when we look at the entire country, not necessarily in particular states, but we look at the entire country. But here's a little piece of that I want to talk about. It's been reported basically with a straight face that Obama gets between 90 and 95% of the African American vote. And clearly this shows, if you're, depending on what you're listening to, it's racism in the electorate, or it's an amazing that have a black president, or whatever it is. No Democratic candidate in the last 40 years has gotten less than 83% of the African American vote. None. And when you get to the Reagan years, it goes up to above 90%, about where it is now with Obama. And so another way to look at that is, look at the presidential election results from Washington, D.C. Last time I looked, 92% voted for Obama, and 3% voted for Romney. And so that's telling you that a lot of times we break these things down, we give them a meaning that may or may not be there. Latinos, classic thing, we talk about Latinos. Geez Louise, people from the Dominican Republic are very different than people from El Salvador, different from Mexico. We have a huge Mexican population here. There's people who don't speak Spanish as their first language from Mexico. That's a big thing. So how do we deal with that? Another thing to look at in terms of the split, generational changes. In Florida, the Cuban Americans clearly are a big part of that Latino vote. For the first time in the past 50 years, they split 50-50 for the Republican Democratic candidate. Why? Because it's your grandparents' problem, what happened with Castro, that made you leave the country. As your children or grandchildren, we're worried about what everybody else is worried. We're worried about the economy. We're worried about the issues that are surrounding us. And so we see those things change, not because the parties are changing, but because time goes on and the groups themselves begin to change.
Yeah, John Bell, former member. I'm really concerned about the high cost of running for office. $8 billion is too much money. You've got to spend all your time campaigning, getting money, and of course with the money comes the responsibility, especially when you have somebody giving you millions of dollars. They have an inside ear against people that only give you $5 or $10. I mean, and maybe we have to look at maybe running our period less time. Instead of having 6 to 8 months of campaigning, we'll get it down to 3 or 4. And maybe that could. I'm glad I'm not in Ohio where they had maybe 46,000 ads for both sides. I mean, no, that's unreal. And the only one that makes money on that is the TV stations. Not the radio stations, not the newspapers, but the TV's got all that money. And they didn't learn any more about the candidates either way. They just had all this negative advertising.
Go to Nevada. Up until 2.5 weeks ago, so we haven't counted the last 2.5 weeks, 75,000 ads on the presidential race. And one television station in Las Vegas got a third of them. And they're owned by somebody who doesn't live in Las Vegas, and so all the money's going to go to somewhere else. And the station, they're saying, where do we get, we need a better set. But so the money's stunning. Here's the thing on the money. The Supreme Court has ruled that money is speech. In places like Oregon, we have no campaign finance laws, except you have to report it really quickly. And until there's basically people rising up, this might be one of those third-party issues, until the people rising up, it's not going to change. It's not going to change. Obama was being outraised by Romney, and he was being outraised by Romney and the super PACs, and so what did Obama do? He basically geared up with his donations, and a lot of them come from smaller donors. Those smaller donors responded, and they were able to then counter the super PACs, but he started his own super PAC as well. That's what Rahm Emanuel's job was. And so the money is there, and it's been there from the beginning. Isn't it better to have the old days when they didn't do it with money, they gave out rum at the polling place? Just saying. But it's going to continue to be a problem until we the people rise up and say we're not going to do it. Think about the change of money that you've seen just in the past 30 years. It used to be bad to be a millionaire. Now it's good to be a millionaire because you can run for office without taking outside money. And so it changes with time, but it's going to be there.
Well, it's good to be a millionaire unless you're called a 1%er. Then it's bad to be a millionaire. But Yeah, I don't see that changing. Unfortunately, the point was also made that wouldn't it be nice if politics were more local? And on the local level, I think candidates do have the opportunity. You know, in public relations, you talk about earned media and paid media. Earned media would be publicity and news stories and other things that are known about you in the community. So as a supporter of the Public Relations Society, I have to say, supporting local candidates through articles, news stories, and other ways that you can interact with the community can have a positive influence that can overshadow the influence of just money.
Harry Bodine, Forum member. In Multnomah County, the average household's property tax is going to go up about $600 next year. Great support at the polls. In Washington County, our enhanced sheriff's patrol, 5248, which is a percentage, a yes vote, much lower than it has been in the past. Any explanation for that?
Well, I think the biggest thing I would conclude from that is Multnomah County is like a female who doesn't have the ability to say no. It's, look out. Multnomah County is a big supporter of all things that feel good in the heart. You know, schools, libraries, arts, so many things. And, you know, I hate to say this, it's one of the reasons why my family and I moved out of Multnomah County, because they just can't say no to these new taxes, and it's going to hurt them. Not so much in the long run either. Washington County went through its own kind of resurgence. I think in 2008, 2010, we also had library levies, sheriff levies, had a big parks bond, other things in Washington County that saw our rates increase, but I think Washington County is a somewhat more fiscally conservative county. It tends to be more focused on the essentials, and why the sheriff's district was hurt, I think maybe it's related to the economy, but it did pass. I think that's the key thing, is the sheriff levy did pass, and our library levies have passed also. Maybe not by huge margins, but I think we're a more frugal community, frankly, is my opinion.
Just one little extra Washington County thing. Unincorporated Washington County, where the sheriff's levy went, is by far the second largest city in the state. By far. Like 100,000 more than Salem, Eugene. And so we are going to be facing questions of funding and what we do in the next probably 5 to 15 years that are just going to be immense and make us look more like Multnomah County in terms of things. And remember, we're expected within 20 years to have more people here than Multnomah County. Will the political center of the state actually shift over here? I don't know. The television stations in Oregonian keep saying Portland's the only place around here. But there's going to be changes happening. Once again, those demographic changes that are going to lead to different answers to some of those questions.
Just one more comment before I quit here. I do wish that Multnomah County would figure it out as well as Washington County has in terms of economic development. We've got Intel, we've got Nike, we've got so many development, because what we're finding now is that a tremendous number of commuters are now coming from Multnomah County to Washington County. So if we could teach them how to do economic development, our traffic would be better.
Chris Leslie, former member. This is a question that is in part, two parts. One, are churches and nonprofits a big part of the donations to these political parties? And two, would a Republican atheist believes in women's rights get elected?
I don't think the churches and nonprofits are even on a par of any sort with the unions as a political money engine. Democrats rely heavily on the unions and contributions from the rank and file as well. So, no. I'd say the answer to that is no. Jim?
Real quick, two more questions and we'll let these folks get out of here. So we have two people sitting here and I think we'll wrap it up at that point.
We'll make it like the Multnomah County elections. We're going to put a sheriff's deputy right there to cut off the line. Here's what we know from national money, which we've been tracking in a big way for the past 40 years. 2/3 of the money comes from business. 2/3. Unions, about 15%. And the rest is all the rest. Here in Oregon, because the Democratic Party does so well, it's going to be more equal between the unions and the business. But the churches basically don't play a big role here, except in trying to get people to turn out. The churches tried to play a big role when we had the religious right as a big factor here in the 1990s. It didn't go very far. Nationally, there's been something of a pushback anytime a church seems to go across the line. There are liberal groups that then sue them or challenge the IRS to revoke their tax exemption. But this is why, we saw it in 2008, we're continuing to see it now. The fall of the religious right as really a big player. Here's a remarkable thing that happened. Billy Graham came out, I don't know if any of you saw this, but in national media, had a full-page ad in national newspapers, all but saying, vote for Mitt Romney. This is going to be my last election. Make sure you vote for your values. And what did it do? It didn't appreciably change anything. And so this is another place where you're putting your money in different places. A lot of people that were part of the religious right and thought their churches would be political centers have now said, we need to focus on local things, we need to focus on changing, in effect, where we live, not the big issues, because we're just not getting the change that we want.
Thank you.
Lee Hunt, forum member. I wonder if, I think it's a little too early to have good figures, but after the Supreme Court reaffirmed the fact that corporations are citizens, people worried about corporations swamping elections, and then we heard, well, unions can swamp them too. Is anybody trying to keep track of the money, whether it's balanced or imbalanced? Any agency or anything?
Yes, they are trying to keep track of it. We have a federal elections commission, and even though the Supreme Court said that the limits are off, you can have these super PACs, they're still under the FEC, but here's the dirty thing about the FEC, it's 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. They haven't agreed on anything in 3 years. And when people leave the FEC, they can't even agree on who ought to be appointed to be on the FEC. So there is, in effect, no national enforcement mechanism for any of this right now. Here at the state, once again, we just don't have anything except report your money fast. That's it. So people are looking at it. Here's the thing about the super PACs. If you look at the trajectory of money coming into campaigns beginning in about the mid-1980s, Ronald Reagan really changed the amount of money that was coming in, the way he ran his campaigns, that kind of thing. It's a straight line that goes up. And the super PACs didn't cause it to go up at a higher rate. It's still about the same as we would have expected without the super PACs. Super PACs were very important at state level elections for Senate, governor, things like that. But at the presidential election, they just got lost in a sea of money that Romney and Obama were raising.
Ernie Foster, forum member. With the big division in the country, do you think Obama is going to be able to balance the budget?
No. But nobody could balance the budget right now. The budget, we've got too many things that we want to do, and when we want to cut things, we want to cut the things we have a pet peeve about. We don't want to look at the budget as a whole. So Republicans will not look at the defense budget, and Democrats won't look there either because then they'll be soft on defense and it might hurt. And nobody seriously is looking at the entitlement programs and what they need. Most of which could be fixed with tinkering here, but you've got to tinker and you have to change kind of the future that people have anticipated. But that third rail is out there. That's why the sequestration, that part of the fiscal cliff coming up in the 31st of December, was designed basically to get the attention of Congress because it's going to gore everybody's ox. It's going to hit all of them, including defense in a big way. Is that enough to get their attention for a balanced budget? No. Is it enough to avoid the fiscal cliff? I think yes, but with this Congress and this president, who knows how that's going to turn out.
I think candidate Romney attempted to be the president and said he was going to address these fiscal issues, but unfortunately he wasn't specific enough. And I talked to a lot of moderate folks who said, I don't really see how he's going to cut taxes and still get the economy under control. Cut taxes without cutting spending. There's not enough money in the general fund that he could cut and have a significant impact on the budget. So I don't think people had confidence that either one of the candidates was going to be tough on the economy, or excuse me, tough on the budgets and reducing the deficit. And so I think that's one of the areas where Romney fell very short, unable to articulate exactly how he was going to pull this off. So I think it's going to be kind of status quo and turf protection in DC, business as usual.
Let's give a hand to both these gentlemen. They look great over. The issue of growth, we're going to deal with, the forum's going to depart a little bit from its usual form in January. We're going to have a kind of a forum, we're going to bring a bunch of folks in, it's going to be over a month. It's going to be the mayors, other opinion shakers, because as Professor Moore pointed out and Mike Riley referred to, Washington County is going to change pretty radically pretty soon. And with the forum's a nice vehicle. We have a lot of people here who shape opinions. You go to these transportation things, you see 3 people. You go to the highway thing, you see 2 people. I mean, nobody's really participating in large nature in a lot of these things. The urban growth boundary thing, which is one of the biggest ones, there were 15 people. It's the same 15 people I saw at the other 3 meetings I went to. So hopefully the forum can generate enough interest, and we'll bring some things. We got televised, we're going to be some streaming videos. So that's in January. We have high hopes for it. Libraries are next. Again, we're trying to, the librarian's going to show why we ought to pay for libraries when everything's digitized and on the internet. So that'll be an interesting program, I hope. Then we're going to do a senior program after that. AARP is going to appear. We're going to talk about senior issues. So those are 2 major ones before the end of the year. Then we're going to have our Christmas program in January. And bicycle and transportation is our final one. So before the Christmas program. So we're going to take the 2 weeks off, and then we're going to come back and try to do something serious. I'm going to try to get Professor Moore to get some of his students interested, as I've been twitting every humanities teacher in the metropolitan area. So thank you very much for your time. We went long. Nobody's working full time today, I don't think, but thank you.